Welcome back to Hemp Forward. In this session, we're talking about the regulatory reality. Where's the legal battle headed? Certainly, the 2018 Farm Bill helped clarify some things regarding hemp, but there's still many questions to be answered as state and federal agencies battle over what those regulations might be. And with COVID, it has certainly set back some of those regulations right now and leaves us with many uncertainties. So visiting with me are Courtney Barnes with Barnes Kaplan and Garrett Graff, who's with the Hoban Law Group. And you know, there are a lot of legal questions, certainly for farmers as they think about growing hemp. Why don't you just both kind of give me the general landscape of where we sit right now legally growing hemp? 2018 did a lot to clarify, but where do we sit right now?
Sure. I mean, looking at the 2018 Farm Bill, it's certainly the first and best step forward with respect to hemp legalization on a national scale for decades. So certainly I think that creates a great threshold starting place. However, I think we've now entered and are firmly within a transitional period from the 2014 Farm Bill, which legalized hemp but only under state regulation, to now transitioning towards the USDA regulation. But even just recently, Congress has now pushed that out a year further. So we remain in a patchwork of regulation at both the state and federal level in terms of what applies. Courtney, what other thoughts do you have?
Absolutely. I mean, as he said, the 2018 Farm Bill removed hemp from the Controlled Substances Act, meaning that hemp is no longer to be treated as a drug under the purview of the DEA. But we are still very much in a transitional period with respect to how the DEA is kind of handling that transition, as well as how the USDA is working to implement this new robust commercial program at the federal level, while having to sort of acknowledge and deal with the 40 or so states that had already implemented research pilot programs under the 2014 Farm Bill. So we've come a long way, but a long way to go.
I mean, ultimately what we're seeing right now is you see a number of states that are still state regulated, and so there's state registrations available through those states, and they're actually hearkening back to the 2014 Farm Bill. However, then you have a number of states that have either not yet set up their programs, and so they're in deference to the USDA, so farmers in those states would actually apply to the USDA, and or some newer states coming online have created a program consistent with and approved by the USDA. And so again, it just leaves this patchwork of regulation and or patchwork of where farmers need to go for purposes of registering themselves. But in theory, it's certainly far easier. As Courtney noted, it's no longer a controlled substance, which should be a positive note, but some work remains to be done.
So you're both mentioning the patchwork. So how do the farmers navigate the patchwork? If I'm in a certain state, how do I figure out, what I need to do and whose laws or regulations I'm abiding by?
Sure. So put simply, a state has to authorize or at least not prohibit the production of hemp in its jurisdiction. So you have these three main categories, which is one, hemp is still prohibited under criminal law. It's treated as marijuana. I think we're almost past that point, but there are some states that haven't implemented programs yet. Then there are other states that either adopted research pilot programs under the 2014 Farm Bill and are continuing to operate. So in those states, a farmer would go to their state Department of Agriculture and could apply for a license to cultivate hemp through that, or a university. And then the 2018 Farm Bill created the commercial regulatory program, where under that regime, you could either apply under a state that has a kind of approved regulatory plan with the USDA, and you would still go through and apply with that Department of Agriculture. Or if the state hasn't had a USDA plan approved and is not operating under the 2014 Farm Bill, you would have to apply, as he said, directly to the USDA for a license to cultivate legally. So while it's not a drug, you can't just do whatever you want with it or just go plant it in your backyard. You need to make sure that you're at least following the state rules for hemp production.
What I might even suggest, to put it more simply, is just go to your state Department of Agriculture, right? Courtney and I, perhaps have a much higher level and broader view as we, work with clients and farmers and folks across the country, right? So, it's our job to kind of navigate 50 states. But for farmers, right, they're in a singular state in most cases, maybe a handful. The easiest resource is to simply go to your state Department of Agriculture. They'll either provide you with the resources of here's what our state system looks like, or tell you, hey, we're not yet on board at the state level, you need to go to the USDA. And then secondarily, I think, in terms of compliance, it's dictated by what are you growing for? And I'm sure we'll get into more of that, but, I think that then, starts contemplating things along the supply chain of fiber versus cannabinoids, different finished consumer goods, and that will, of course, dictate further compliance issues. But at the threshold level, simply putting seeds in the ground or clones in the ground, just go to your Department of Agriculture.
So as we navigate the patchwork, how is this going to begin to sort itself out? How do we begin, or do we get to something that is a more national type of regulation as opposed to different states doing different things?
That's what's in the works right now with the USDA. The USDA actually in late 2019 issued their regulations that are intended to do just that, provide uniformity and consistency across the United States. However, as you might expect with any federal bureaucratic regulation, it may not be perfect, and certainly there's a number of issues and/or perceived flaws within those regulations that I think a number of states and/or industry stakeholders have with those regulations. And so there's been endeavors in working in conjunction and in collaboration with the USDA to make those fixes. With COVID and everything else that's impacting our economy right now, obviously that's moved much more slowly than anticipated. And so the 2014 Farm Bill has thus been extended another year as a bridge into 2021. And so hopefully by the end of 2021 we will have greater perspective as to what those uniform regulations will be across the country going forward.
Courtney, is that how you see things shaking out?
Yeah, the 2018 Farm Bill was intended to create a federal regulatory framework under which all states would have some authority to kind of, customize their plans, but are expected to adhere to a foundational set of standards. The 2014 Farm Bill extension sort of prolongs this patchwork, but it was necessary because of some of the problematic provisions in the interim final rule and states' reluctance to transition their 2014 Farm Bill programs into 2018 Farm Bill programs just because of the difficulty they found in administering and enforcing these pretty onerous regulations. So hopefully this additional time will allow for more input and industry stakeholder participation to come to some compromises that make more practical sense from a policy perspective.
When we're talking about regulations, and I'm talking to farmers, one of the things I hear all the time is THC, 0.3%. I'm interested, your thoughts on that. Is it too restrictive, and will we stay there, or are we going to move from that? Because any farmer, that's something that's on their mind, that 0.3% THC.
Two separate answers, I suppose, to that question for sure. Would I have picked 0.3% as a threshold for controlling a chemical constituent of a plant that grows naturally? No. Do I think that you could have a greater number and still ensure the safety and protection of America? Absolutely. But given that Congress created that threshold, and there are countries that have more stringent THC standards, like 0.2%, I think our work is best served in kind of working to frame how that is enforced and kind of understood in practicality. I don't see the 0.3% changing anytime soon, but I could be wrong. I'm totally, I'd hope,
0.3% was established perhaps arbitrarily a few decades ago by scientists researching cannabis. Again, that was to draw the perceived line in the sand as to what is psychoactive versus what is non-psychoactive. And I think it's the sentiment there that matters, right? Because when you start then talking about legislation, you have to establish consensus amongst bipartisanship through Congress, right? And so in doing so, you need to get both red and blue legislators on board. And so certainly it's much more difficult if you're starting to infringe upon the psychoactive components. Now that said, I think more recent science might suggest that 0.3% is too low. But again, this is a function where science and research has been very limited in the past couple decades. And so it's very anecdotal, I think, to say the least, in terms of what that threshold should be. From that standpoint, I think arguments can be made that it was too low. I agree with Courtney that I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. I hear a number of folks that are pushing for 1.0% or whatnot. And again, I think that there's a couple political realities to be to take it note of. You have conservative legislators that their constituents are certainly much more concerned, right or wrong, about the potential psychoactivity of something that's 1.0%, which by the way could well get you high depending on how much you consume. And then secondarily, it actually starts then infringing upon the marijuana industry that, while it remains federally illegal, is state lawful. So you actually have almost then a competition with your own cousin of the marijuana industry that I think is going to prove difficult to pass any legislation that changes that standard. So for better or for worse, I think it's trying to figure out ways in which we can work within the constraints we have now while working towards eventual change of those policies.
Both of you are working with farmers, and you're hearing farmers from, I'm betting, all across the region. So what are some of the legal issues that they're running into that perhaps somebody's considering growing hemp may not have thought of, because you're around those perhaps pitfalls or challenges all the time? Courtney?
I think the individual and varied testing regimes for each state of where you're growing, you need to understand exactly how your crop will be tested for THC content. That makes a big difference. Also, buying seeds that are from other jurisdictions with different climates and different growing kind of environments, and understanding that your farm may not produce the same quality or crop that it was represented to have where it was originally grown and tested for those metrics. So I think it's sort of just kind of trying to create uniformity from a very, very disparate patchwork of laws and just experience as well.
Where do we start? It's a laundry list long, to be honest, both of legal issues as well as in practical or pragmatic ones. With respect to the legal issues that we see, first and foremost, we talked about this 0.3% rule. While in some jurisdictions, in some states, that's measured by delta 9 THC only. In other jurisdictions, that's measured by what's considered total THC, which takes into account 88% of THCA, the acid form of THC. And so you have to use the lowest common denominator between the two if you want to create a marketable product. Then furthermore, what if I hit 0.31? In some states, there's different enforcement discretion being authorized to certain levels in terms of, what is that margin of error? Thankfully, the USDA's regulations do account for a measurement of uncertainty or a margin of error, and most states will allow for certain margins of error to 0.35 or 0.4. But again, farmers don't want to hear the idea of going to jail. Many of them may fear how they look in orange jumpsuits. And understandably so. And so, with that in mind, it's certainly how do you manage those genetics? And furthermore, then it goes to the lack of certification on a widespread scale. Many farmers are used to using certified ayahuasca certified seed. While that exists with certain fiber-based varieties in Europe historically, cannabinoid-based varieties are very new. And so from that perspective, there's very little in the way of certified seed, at least pursuant to ayahuasca or objective standards. And furthermore, even if it is certified, to ensure that it actually performs well, I think this is kind of what Courtney was touching on. I can't tell you how many lawsuits we've seen over feminized seed, or what was promised to be feminized seed that turns out not to be feminized seed. So it ruins at least a portion, if not all, of a crop. Or it's promised to be 0.25% THC and in fact pops hot at 1.0. And so there's a lot of issues throughout the supply chain there in terms of what farmers can realistically rely upon while maintaining legal compliance.
Absolutely. I think the investment in the size and acreage you plant versus the risk of, potential non-compliance, as well as making sure you have buyers lined up and that you've understood, the whole supply chain and the differences between, having confirmed sellers for other crops versus hemp, which is a bit more uncertain right now, especially for new operators.
Well, and that raises a good point, Courtney, in terms of, what is in demand. And that kind of hinges a little bit on the practical side of things in terms of what practically affects farmers, but it's also the legal aspect. And what I mean by that is, initially when the hemp industry first started in the US, 3, 4, 5 years ago in terms of cultivation, the rage was all about CBD. We've now seen a decline, a commoditization of CBD, and now the industry is starting to seek other pathways to, create, margins and profit throughout the supply chain. But what has that led to? That's led to things like smokable hemp. That's led to things like exploring other minor cannabinoids like CBN or CBG, or perhaps more relevantly, delta 8 THC. And so it's these kind of gray area or marginalized products that actually, create some economic or practical issues for farmers, but because of the economic promise of some of these products that are kind of almost in the gray area, it creates potential legal issues. I can't tell you how many farmers I've seen that want to cultivate hemp for smokable hemp, but then they try to sell it into a jurisdiction that doesn't allow for it, and so it gets seized, and so they now have to take a loss on that entire crop. And so there's a lot of overlap and commingling between those two.
I think that both of you see promise in this industry, and we want to talk about farmers that are thinking about doing this. So while we both like you both, we don't want to run into legal trouble. So give me the positive side of this. As a farmer that's wanting to do this, how can I feel confident about, hey, I can do this and I can do this and not run afoul of the law? Walk me through that process so I can feel confident about what I want to do.
Sure. So it really is just getting to know your jurisdiction and the regulations that apply there. It is totally possible. It's actually becoming progressively more friendly. There are, almost 50 states that have adopted programs, and some of them have been operating for a while. So talk to your Department of Agriculture. We do recommend having legal counsel because it is a very nuanced and, compliance intensive business, but it's absolutely doable, and it's just really making sure that you're educated, you understand the risks as well as the benefits, and that you are truly trying to, build something genuine and real and have passion for it and understand, the potential uses. I think those that aren't just trying to make a quick profit are going to do far better in the long term, because this is an investment. It's an investment from compliance, it's an investment from economics, it's a sincere investment with huge long-term potential if you do it right from the beginning.
So I think there's a number of important points to understand. Bipartisan support in Congress and in many states. Unlike marijuana, the cousin of hemp, unlike many other issues in Washington, D.C. these days, bipartisan support is an ally to the hemp industry and thus to the farmers that want to participate in it. So for those reasons, hemp was first legalized in 2014. It was expounded upon in the 2018 Farm Bill. So therein lies, further support and additional support year after year by the legislators and the regulators who matter. And so, as you might expect with any emerging marketplace, any new marketplace, you're going to have these growing pains. So certainly what Courtney and I do are navigating those growing pains and help defend the farmers and the other stakeholders in the industry. But that's anticipated, right? What new industry hasn't experienced those? So the fact that we're going through that right now shouldn't be surprising or unexpected. If anything, it's what potentially creates greater opportunity for farmers if they're smart about how they exploit and utilize that opportunity. But you do have to have a little bit of an appetite for the bumps along the way. That said, with respect to all those bumps along the way, we're not talking about orange jumpsuits in the DEA. They've in writing expressly said, we are hands off to hemp. And you've seen that by many states as well. So it's one thing to deal with the DEA and, in that realm, but instead you're dealing with the same regulators you've dealt with for your entire careers as a farmer, your respective State Department of Agriculture. You might be dealing with the State Department of Health with respect to some of the, the products that you're making. Those acronyms and those agencies should not scare you. And for those reasons, you've seen continued enforcement discretion for the past 5, 6+ years by those agencies in terms of helping shepherd this emerging industry forward. So for those reasons, you need to have that appetite and that ability to pivot and experience those bumps along the way. But we are moving forward. We are establishing progress, and so that's important for farmers to take note of.
So right now with the two of you, you're obviously working in the hemp industry. What are you doing then to advocate or support that in these legal issues?
So our firm is based in Denver, but we actually have attorneys around the country and around the globe. And so through that, we're working in jurisdictions to help create uniform regulations across the board. Furthermore, our law firm has joined with some other law firms in the hemp industry to file petitions in courts to challenge adverse rulings like that of the DEA and other agencies to counteract some of this vagueness or ambiguity or uncertainty that's being created by agencies out there. We're working in collaboration with the USDA, with the FDA, with customs and other agencies that matter to help counteract all these uncertainties plaguing the industry to date and help push the industry forward.
Absolutely. I think education and helping people understand these laws, understand how they're practically implemented and enforced, encouraging people to participate in the regulatory process where you have a say. Like, you can still submit comments on the DEA's interim final rule. There will be a comment period for FDA products that's indefinitely open. It's really just trying to get involved, expressing your opinion, learning, and creating community in the space, because the more people you have that are aligned in the same vision for a future in a regulatory environment, the more influence you'll be able to have on regulators who, don't have that experience.
So thinking about some of the advocacy that you just spoke about, where do you think things will move then? How do you see some of these regulations playing out 1, 2, 3 years down the road? Courtney?
I think we will eventually 1, 2, 3 years down the road have a lot more consistency and clarity as to the regulatory environment. As he mentioned, the 2014 Farm Bill will continue that patchwork, but we are accepting comments on these rules. There will be a final rule published for the USDA's regulatory structure for implementation of the 2018 Farm Bill. And once we have real permanent federal regulations in place, you will have a much easier path to follow, not necessarily in, compliance or that those regulations, as he said, will be perfect, but you'll know exactly what you need to do. And I think same with the FDA as we get up the supply chain into consumer products. We are waiting on their enforcement discretion guidance for ingestible products containing CBD, but in the next 2 to 3 years, I would hope to at least be pushing or commencing down the regulatory pathway for actual administrative rules governing the production and sale of ingestible products. So there's a lot of potential, but I wouldn't hold my breath just yet.
I think it's important that we look at this both in the short term and long term, what we can reasonably expect. In the short term, as we've discussed, we're in the middle of this transitional period. We have both the continued existence of the 2014 Farm Bill. We have the continued attempt to implement the 2018 Farm Bill. Over the course of the next 12 to 18 months, we should see greater progress. The types of advocacy that our law firms and other industry stakeholders are taking upon ourselves should help influence the implementation of the 2018 Farm Bill, helping address things like the total THC rule and the testing limits and other perceived flaws within the USDA's interim final rule.
The non-enforced DEA testing and disposal requirement, which was actually a good example of industry input and pushback helping to at least change the enforcement policy of a pretty ridiculous policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great example, and I think we all have to take into account the impact that COVID has had, right? 2020 has almost been scrapped effectively as a year in terms of trying to influence or affect change, both from industry and from the governmental agencies. And so for that reason, there just simply is more time needed, which is why Congress extended the existence of the 2014 Farm Bill. So again, over the next 12 to 18 months, I think you will start to see greater certainty from the federal level that will then in turn trickle down to the state level and help get states that are currently remaining on the 2014 Farm Bill to adhere to the 2018 Farm Bill. So I would expect over the next 2 to 3 years, I'll probably give it 24 plus months, to see the majority of states start incrementally adhering to the 2018 Farm Bill and the USDA's regulations. So call it 2022, 2023, where you start seeing the actual implementation and realization of those regulations on the books. Throughout the course, I think you will continue to see enforcement discretion, so I don't think that farmers should feel the pressure of we must wait necessarily until then, just because I think you will continue to see growth and agencies exercising their own discretion and in support of the industry. That said, I think there's also then a strong influence from the supply chain. As Courtney was indicating, I think there's influence from the FDA. What types of products are or are not allowed? Over the past several years within the hemp industry, you've seen folks go from CBD to smokable hemp to Delta 8, kind of jumping from flash in the pan, to flash in the pan. And so I think some of that will start to regulate itself a little bit more as FDA comes out with greater certainty. I think you will start to see more diversification of crop to help, defend against, going all in on a particular crop that loses all of its economic interest or value or demand, and so I think that that's important for farmers to account for as they start planning acreage and crop and planting is not where we are now, but where are we headed? Will 3 to 5 years from now smokable hemp be allowed and in demand? Right. The same thing for Delta 8 THC and other components of hemp, and we don't know the answers to those questions yet, but farmers need to be looking at that because obviously that will then dictate where they're able to get the greatest realization on their crop. That said, I think it's important to note that even on perhaps the unsexy fiber side of the hemp industry, you're still being able to get a solid return on your crop relative to long-standing existing agricultural commodities. Just so many have fallen entrapped by the allure of CBD being thousands of dollars per acre that no longer exists. And so just be careful about going on that wild goose chase.
I also think it's definitely worth pursuing and looking into the industrial uses of hemp. Although we don't have the processing infrastructure like some other countries do to make this more of a focal point of our industry at this point in time, the potential is almost limitless. There are so many applications that you can use that don't involve, concentrating cannabinoids, and that can actually be successfully produced with less risk of going hot or having an unlawful THC content, because you're not growing for those uses. So I think we're a little bit a ways, but the potential there is huge.
Courtney, Garrett, thank you both for joining me and talking a little bit about legal issues.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure.
Yep. Up next, we're going to go to J.P. Kaloi in Hawaii. He's going to be talking about the regulatory environment and what high-grade hemp seed is doing about it.
Currently, the regulatory landscape for our industry spans across our supply chain, and really what we feel is something that needs to be addressed in way of regulation is the end product. We can produce the most compliant and the most high quality seed. We can sell it to farmers who produce the most high quality flowers and biomass. However, once they hand it over to the processors, there's somewhat of a bottleneck with some of the hang up in both the DEA and the FDA approval for the CBD and other cannabinoids and ingredients that are derived from the cannabis plant. It's my opinion that, or rather, I'm hoping that some of these regulatory bodies are going to be leveraging people within the industry that have the know-how and the understanding of both processes, the risks, and the concerns of the regulatory bodies, and we'll be able to marry both those concerns and the best practices that needs to be done so that we can find the best way moving forward for all parties. So one of the hiccups currently in the extraction process is there is a work in progress that had previously been sought after from the industry that would allow them to either report or remediate the THC that is of concern from the DEA. The DEA's IFR currently does not allow for that. And so there is a major concern for the extraction companies that all of a sudden they're going to be in violation of federal law when really they have the know-how of how to remediate and separate that out. It's just there needs to be a clear path on what to do with the THC once that has been removed. Beyond that, even when you get the extraction, there's quite a bit of a bottleneck with where those, whether it's extracted, distillate, or isolate, and which products those are actually allowed to be put into, because the FDA has not approved any of that. So that is going to be a huge hurdle that we need to get through before really we can see this market flourish. I think there is going to be somewhat of a holding pattern in the next couple of years. I think that you'll see the USDA hopefully extend out the authority of the 2014 Farm Bill, because there's many states that aren't prepared themselves to implement the rules and standards set forth within that bill. From a private industry standpoint, I think that companies will continue to try to understand the regulations that are being put forth for us to follow. I think it's extremely important for companies and individuals to continue to advocate for common sense change that, again, will both address the needs and best practices of our industry, as well as still take into consideration at least some of the concerns from the regulatory bodies and marry them up so that we can move forward. High-grade hemp seed will continue to advocate for what we believe is the best for both our company, our customers, and the industry as a whole. We'll look to have those conversations with the regulatory bodies and the key individuals, as well as create those strategic partnerships with other companies to find common ground and really advocate for what we think is going to improve the situation in the next couple of years and the future beyond that. One of the other key things that we'll continue to do is educate both ourselves, our customers, and our partners at those regulatory bodies on, current best practices and things that could possibly or maybe should be considered when these laws and regulations are being put in place.
Well, next on Hemp 4, we're going to go into the lab. We're going to talk about genetics and what you need to know before you put seed in the ground.